All right. Hi, everyone. You seem so far away. Come closer. First of all, I'd like to just welcome everyone to this event, for those of you here in person and to those online. I think we're more online than in person, and that's wonderful. I was just trying to recall, it was almost 5 years ago where we met here, Michael, Donald, we had a similar, it feels like deja vu. We had a little meeting here, and it was really the start of this relationship that we have. And I was just trying to think what has, how to move the slides forward. Oh, sorry, go back. Right. And I was just going through time, what's happened between 2018, when we met here first time, and today. And a lot has happened. It's been a very exciting time. In 2018, we had just launched the South African CF registry. It was also the year that Curtis Care Hospital did its first lung transplant for someone with CF. In 2019, Trikafta was approved for the first time. Then there was a terrible 2 years where the world stopped. The COVID pandemic happened. And it's a time I think we all like to put behind us. And unfortunately, that was not a good time for CF and for everyone. But then Trixicor appeared on the scene. Gaydor became a player, especially for South Africans. And here we are in 2023 with the incredible story of the High Court application, where South Africans have been leading the race. So a lot has happened in the 5 years since we last met here. And I just wanted to, the purpose of this, my introduction here is, I just wanted to remind everyone that it started, or we have the CF registry, which was essentially launched here at this event. It's very active. It's in its 5-year anniversary. And we have two incredible people, Marlies, who's based in Joburg, and Janine here in Cape Town, who help us collect all the data and information every year and produce the reports and data statistics that we have been using. And how has this registry helped us? We've been able to document people with CF in South Africa. We have established that 90% of people on the registry are eligible for modulators based on their genetics. It's helped us conduct some research, and that's ongoing. We're able to track the movement of people and the well-being of people with CF. And very importantly, it's really helped us in advocacy, in dealing with the suppliers of modulators, Vertex Save Us, and the High Court application, when providing data to support the processes. And here is just an example of the registry report and map of where people are getting care in South Africa. And you can see here is updated and with various statistics, and this is all available online. And I just thought I'd update some key things for you to see. To summary from 2018 to 2022, you can see we have 520 people who were captured in the registry. New diagnoses, notice how they've dropped. Then that was correlates, I think, with the COVID years. So we're still waiting for new people to be discovered down the line. We looked at key things like how many people died, a huge number in 2020. And I highlight this rate because these potentially are all people whose deaths could have been prevented by access to modulators, and as well as the number of people who've had transplants. But excitingly, more and more people are on modulators, and most of these on the Trikafta, the Trixicor, and the numbers are growing. In terms of research, we also have some work to do. This is just some data to show a study. We looked at South Africans and Canadians using registry data to show differences in lung function and outcome. And unfortunately, as we expect, South Africans are not doing as well as the Canadians. But so there's still some work to do. So this, however, the registry takes time and a bit of money to keep to the people who help us collect the data. But we've been very fortunate, so thanks for the various industry sponsorships, donations, and grants. but it will be an ongoing concern. And lastly, I just want to thank everyone in this enormous effort in the last 5 years. Thanks those to who've made all these changes possible. I want to thank Donald and his family for initiating this event and coming back to us again, introducing us to Michael, who's become a real friend for South Africa and the CF community, and everyone else. There's so many names. So I don't want to steal their thunder. So I'm going to first of all introduce, it's Belinda on the program. Yep. So Belinda now came to meet her during the last few years. And tonight was the first time we actually met in person. It's all been via a computer screen. And Belinda now is an amazing person. She has been a force of nature in South Africa's initiative and advocacy for treatment. If she's the most thorough internet sleuth that I've known, she'll dig up anything, anywhere, and she's on top of everything all the time. So Belinda has been working with Vertex Save Us. She represents South Africa at the international stage. She's very active in the advocacy programs and the campaign. So without delay, Belinda, the stage is yours. And we love to hear what you've been up to. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Okay. So today I would like to address the urgent need for affordable access to cystic fibrosis modulators and how this access can impact patients' lives. So my journey actually began in 2014 after I watched my sister Jenny die, and after being on a ventilator for 3 weeks in ICU. And I promised my younger sister Lauren that I would not let her die the way Jen did. Having two sisters with cystic fibrosis, I was in and out of hospitals for 35 years. And I always joked that I should have had shares in all of these hospitals because sometimes I was mistaken for a nurse. And now Lauren's case was very complicated as she was born under very unlucky stars. So Lauren was diagnosed with epilepsy at a very young age and was on the highest dosage possible, which was actually damaging her liver. But these seizures were not atypical of epilepsy, as she would have over 55 fits a day. After years of research, being an internet sleuth and consulting a neurologist at the beginning of 2018, we discovered that Lauren had NEED. And NEED is a dissociative seizure or non-epileptic attack, and you can have symptoms like epilepsy. And it's the brain's way of dealing with post-traumatic stress and shutting down. So she was put on Fycompa and a little bit of Keppra, and the fits actually stopped and were more manageable because it would only occur when she was anxious. Therefore, I must stress the importance of always looking after your loved one's mental health going forward, especially dealing with a cystic fibrosis patient. Lauren was also diagnosed with high ammonia levels in her blood after a gallbladder surgery. And high ammonia levels is associated with kidney disease, a liver disease, certain genetic disorders, trauma, and seizures. So you can actually connect the dots there. And it became a vicious cycle for Lauren because her high ammonia could cause CF-related respiratory and metabolic acidosis. And acidosis can be fatal because what it means is that you need to have a blood gas test done to measure the amount of carbon dioxide versus oxygen in your blood. And if there's too much CO2, then you need to be placed on a CPAP machine in ICU every single time it happens. In October 2018, Lauren, that's Lauren over there, went into hospital with flu and viral encephalitis, and she spent months in hospital and was discharged oxygen dependent with a lung function of only 15%. She was definitely in the final stages of cystic fibrosis. While we managed to receive Trixicare in December 2021, and she was slowly starting to improve, her CF and CF-related complications were far gone, and she passed away on the 6th of October in 2022, only 48 hours after being admitted into hospital. Therefore, this is why I stress that CF patients need access to modulator treatments at a very young age to prevent the end stages of cystic fibrosis from happening, and what happened to my sisters. Simultaneously, click. Go back. Okay. Okay. So simultaneously, while I was looking after Lauren and working in a silo, I researched every available option and every case study that there was around the world. And I stumbled across Vertex Pharmaceuticals and the CF Buyers Club in 2019. The UK's Orkambi campaign is one of the most notable campaigns and serves as a model for patient advocacy efforts. The strategy for this campaign by CF families entailed demanding the government make a deal with Vertex Pharmaceuticals or to buy generics according to their legislation. So the CF Buyers Club was founded by some of the original members of the UK campaign, Rob Long, and CF parents who flew to Argentina to investigate Gaydor's generic to Orkambi, which was Lucafta. I reached out to Rob and to volunteer to create awareness and assisting with all South African inquiries. It was then I realized it's not what you know, it's who you know that can make things happen for you. Okay. Now, Facebook is a very powerful tool. And one of the CF mommies, Miranda Pretorius, contacted me for more information when I began posting in 2019. It was a pure coincidence that I tagged Dr. Zimboli in one of my posts for the CF Buyers Club, and we started corresponding. And it was the beginning of a beautiful relationship. Together, Miranda and I became Team Melinda, and we collaborated to get Lucafta for her son by writing to Gaydor and receiving the bioequivalence, safety, and efficacy data. I compiled an executive summary and a cost benefits analysis for discovery by using Lauren's expenses from 2018 as a motivation to subsidize the treatment via a South African Section 21 application for non-registered medicines. The application was approved. However, Miranda traveled to Argentina in March 2020, only to be told to board the flight home as soon as she arrived because the country went into COVID lockdown. Disappointment followed, but Miranda repeated the exercise when Trixicare went to market in December 2021 and now heads up the parents group traveling to Argentina with other medical doctors. VSU was launched in October 2020 by Rob Long, Gail Pledger, and Christina Walker. I became involved from day one by doing all the social media and all the investigations. We are a very close-knit group of volunteers and are expanding globally. Right now, we have social media people from around the world, which include the niche skills and capabilities of Sue, Mark, Jolene, Tanya, Rita, Olga, and Urta. Okay, let's take a step back and look at Vertex Pharmaceuticals and the 3 values which drive them as per their website and their PR. Okay, uncompromising commitment to patients. patients are at the center of everything we do. Every decision we make is driven by the patients we serve. Innovation is our lifeblood. At Vertex, we challenge the status quo. We ask what is possible and find new paths to solve difficult and important problems. Fearless pursuit of excellence. We chase excellence, we take calculated risks, learn from both success and failures, and continuously improve at the highest level of personal integrity and ethics. So this is a map from January 2023. Nothing much has changed. You can see in green, that's where the access is agreed for Trikafta reimbursements. It's not extended by ages or groups. And the color in red is the countries that do not have any access to Trikafta. Okay, so now, those are fantastic values for Vertex to have, but they seem to apply to only a small percentage of the global population in high-income countries. If these values were indeed factual, then why are there so many patient advocacy groups, medical professionals, and associations fighting for affordable access? It is patient and patent abuse, and it is actually gross profiteering by inflating the prices of modulated treatments up by 5,000% when studies shown by Jonathan and other people in the Journal of Cystic Fibrosis shows that the estimated cost to produce Trikafta is $6,000 per year. It is unethical for one pharmaceutical company to have the entire sea of market and make their treatments unaffordable and inaccessible. Vertex has patented these modulated treatments in almost every country except for Argentina, where generics are produced and sold to markets. So VSU joined forces with Just Treatment and other patient advocacy groups, medical professionals and researchers globally to improve access to Trikafta in countries. Through their advocacy and our collaborations with organizations, we are making progress to ensure that patients have access to Trikafta. So currently we have members from plus minus 60 countries and growing. And just to put things into perspective for you, the FDA approved Calideco from Vertex in January 2012, Orkambi in 2015, Symdeko in 2018, and Trikafta in October 2019. And most of the countries in red do not even have access to the most basic modulated treatments. But what we all want is access to Trikafta. And so we need to advocate for policy changes to make these medications more widely available. Okay. So this is just the details of what's happening in Argentina, that Argentina has announced that 10 generic medications for cystic fibrosis will be included in their national program. So that also includes Gadol's Trixacar, Ivacor, Lucafta, and Tezacafta, Tuters, or Tutors, generics at Bago and Rafo's treatments as well, which is very, very good news. Okay. So this is the first initial meeting that we had with Vertex on the 30th of June, 2021. And we wanted a commitment to a global access plan to make the CF modulators available to all patients. And we wanted it to be priced affordably, because obviously nothing in life is for free. And we wanted transparency as well with regards to the list of the countries that have access, etc., etc. So Our last meeting we had with Vertex was on the 1st of December 2021. And they said that they are doing away with compassionate access and looking at a donation scheme for the needy. So from 2021 up until now, there's been no feedback whatsoever. Okay, so what we do as VSU, we do global petition awareness, we do videos, we do blogs, we tell people and patient stories from around the world in countries that do not have access. Okay, so from South Africa, I'm sure you are aware of Sherry Nell's case versus Vertex. So basically, in a nutshell, what we're doing is seeking a compulsory license. So to explain that to people that do not know what it is, compulsory licenses is a policy tool we use to create access to medication. This allows the generic versions to be produced by countries other than the patent holder, which can increase competition and lower prices. Compulsory licenses are a little bit controversial, and they're often met with resistance by certain pharmaceutical companies, but they have been used in the past to increase access to life-saving medications, particularly for HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis C. For other countries globally, there are other mechanisms in place to consider where you can look at changing the patent laws or other policy and initiatives to improve access for medication. The lack of access to Trikafta and other cystic fibrosis medications has a real and devastating consequence for patients and their families. Without access, patients with cystic fibrosis face a reduced life expectancy, decreased quality of life, and increased healthcare costs. The economic impact of the cost of treatment can be astronomical, and the financial burden can exacerbate the physical and emotional toll of living with a rare disease for everyone. Obviously, have we seen the international and local media coverage our campaigns have been receiving due to legal actions taken by South Africa, India, Brazil, and the Ukraine? I've taken these images off Twitter. We are active on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, but Twitter gets spread around a lot. This was the article from the New York Times. I had a little photo op in there. The New York Times has a readership of 16 million, and you can see when I took the screenshots, it was read over 922,000 times, and a lot of people have been sharing that. That's the media exposure from Just Treatments going on. This is patient advocacy at its best from the Ukraine and from the USA. Dr. Megan McGarry wrote in the Pediatric Pulmonology publication, how many billions is enough? It was a very impactful article. And this is media coverage in India and Brazil. And our patient advocacy and media coverage in South Africa, especially with spotlights, which had a knock-on effect because that article landed up in News 24 as well as Business Live and the Financial Mail. Okay, so ultimately, the issue of global and affordable access to cystic fibrosis modulators is complex, and it requires a multifaceted approach. We must all unite to address the systematic issues that limit the access to these medications, including high drug prices, inadequate healthcare infrastructure, and regulatory barriers. By doing so, we can ensure that all patients, regardless of where they live, have access to medications they need to live a healthy life. It is also important to remember that behind every statistic And every policy decision, real people are living with cystic fibrosis and are dying waiting for Trikafta. In conclusion, affordable access to cystic fibrosis modulators is not only a matter of public health and human rights, but it's also a matter of economic justice. We must continue to unite globally as one voice to ensure that patients with cystic fibrosis have the treatments they need to live long and healthy lives. And what you can do to help is like and share content on social media, Vertex Save Us, SAGFA pages, sign the global petition, share it, and unite and join in the goal of achieving affordable access. Because as we like to say at Vertex Save Us, no one is left behind. Thank you.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Greg Caligaro, who is my colleague at Groote Hospital. He takes care of CF patients in Cape Town. He is also headed up the lung transplant program at Groote Hospital, which is the only lung transplant program in a state facility in the country. And I think they've done a remarkable success. Him alone and a few other people, and it's quite extraordinary work. And Greg is going to speak to us about the program and its evolution, and we look forward to that. Thank you, Greg.
All right, well, thanks, Marco, for that very kind introduction. It's certainly not me on my own. It's a very big team, which I'm very grateful to be working for. So I'm going to talk about lung transplantation in advanced cystic fibrosis. And I think using the word advanced is important because the trials of all of these CF modulators, at least the ones that were done by the pharmaceutical companies, were only done in patients with an FEV1 above 40%. But I think there's emerging real world evidence that these drugs are effective even in people with more advanced disease. And talking about transplants after, or in this case, due to technical difficulties before CF modulator therapy is really sending the wrong message. And I just want to say, I'm the reluctant pulmonologist who doesn't want people to have lung transplants. This is a therapy of last resort. So this is the outline of my talk. I'm going to talk about lung transplantation. What is it? A rescue therapy for patients with end-stage lung disease. And why should we consider something as complex and intricate as a lung transplant in somebody with CF? There are some unique considerations for the patient with CF when it comes to lung transplant candidacy. I'm going to give you a little taste for the complexity of the procedure. I mean, there is obviously time restrictions, hopefully ready to alert people practicing in South Africa of referral guidelines for lung transplantation in patients with CF. And then lastly, just to discuss the landscape of lung transplantation globally, but particularly in South Africa. And in the interest of time, what I'm not going to cover is an exhaustive discussion of the risks of the lung transplant procedure itself and what the contraindications are, and also to talk about within a unit what the indications for listing are. I'm going to really focus more on referral, which I think is more applicable to this audience. Okay, so what is lung transplant? Well, it's an option of last resort. It's not unique to CF. We can use it in a whole bunch of progressive lung conditions or those for which there's no effective therapy. And as difficult as it is, and as imperfect as it is, it can be completely transformative. And I think it's the successes, and we're going to hear Donald talk a bit later, that carry us through some of the really dark moments, because there's no question that putting somebody else's lungs into your body is an unnatural act. And so there are many complications that have to be dealt with. I think the data is clear. It prolongs life, and it provides a dramatic improvement in quality of life in those patients who survive the operation. And this is data from the US. About 80% of survivors report no activity limitation, and the majority of those return to some form of gainful employment. But it's complex. And its complexity is what's led to it lagging behind other solid organ transplants. Now, we like in Cape Town to remind people that we're the home of the first heart transplant, which as you all know, was done in 1967. But what most people don't know is that the first lung transplant actually happened before that in 1963. But it was beset with immunological and technical complications, and it took about 30 years for it to become an accepted therapy. And in fact, the first transplant for CF, which was actually a combined heart-lung transplant, was done only in 1983, with the first bilateral lung transplant several years after that. Having said that, and having had a long time to catch up to heart, kidney, and liver transplants, lung transplants are fast growing. Okay, they're outstripping heart transplants in most of the world. And year on year, and certainly over the last couple of years, between 5,000 and 6,000 lung transplants are done worldwide. Okay, I'm going to show you some regional numbers for where those transplants are performed, which is a bit more sobering, but this is a rapidly expanding and accepted therapy. Why are lung transplants more challenging than other solid organ transplants? Well, firstly, if you have a donor, the chances that you can use the lung in that donor are much lower than the chance that you can use the heart, the kidneys, or the liver. And these are reasons due to the lungs being involved much more commonly in the mechanism that led to that donor's death. Secondly, lungs are very immunogenic, and the post-transplant immunosuppression that is required is the highest of all the solid organ transplants. And as with all transplantation, the tightrope that is walked is always between rejection and infection. So if you're using more immunosuppression to prevent rejection, then you're at more risk of opportunistic infection. And what is unique about lungs is that they're the only transplant that's in contact with the outside environment. Okay, so infections are much more common in lung transplants versus other solid organ transplants. As I will briefly point out, the post-transplant course is also much more complex. The requirement for extracorporeal oxygenation, which is a way of putting oxygen in the body when the lungs are shocked and not working, is also required. We haven't completely solved the issue of immunosuppression, and a chronic form of rejection, which manifests as a slow reduction in FEV1 over time, develops to a greater or lesser extent in all patients. And because of all of these reasons, the outcomes of lung transplants, although improving, if we look at it by era, still do not match those of other solid organ transplants. So why consider lung transplant in cystic fibrosis? Well, as sobering as it is to speak about this, I'm sure there are few people in the audience that need reminding that CF is a relentlessly progressive disease. This is a graph from the CF Foundation Patient Registry from the United States. And this shows that although, this predates modulator care, but although there have been significant improvements in CF care, which have led to higher FEV1s at every time point in a patient's life. So you can look, if you look at the age of 10, you will see that the latest era, on average, patients have got higher FEV1s than the era of 1998 to 1992. There is a slow, inexorable decline in lung function that happens over time, even with the best therapies available. So what is lung transplant? Well, it's a complex rescue therapy that is there for patients whose lung functions decline. And as shown in the graph on the left-hand side, as you get older, the proportion of patients with moderate and severe impairments in lung function becomes higher. So it's a complex therapy, and it's one that we would prefer that you would never need. But if you develop advanced CF-related lung disease with structural changes that are not going to be modified by modulator therapy, then it's a good parachute to have. If you look at the major indications for lung transplant globally, cystic fibrosis is the third most common cause. In fact, if you look at the almost 70,000 patients that were transplanted in the International Society for Heart and Lung Transplant Registry, about 10,000 patients of those have got cystic fibrosis. So it works out to be 15%. And largely due to modulator therapy, it's one of the indications whose incidence is declining over time. So if you look at the American data, about 5 years ago, it was 15% of all lung transplants, and now it's 13% of all lung transplants. So clearly these drugs are making their effect felt. And of all patients who undergo lung transplants, patients with CF have got the best prognosis. Okay, they live the longest. So almost 10 years median survival. So median survival is the time point at which 50% of patients are still alive. And if you exclude patients that die early on in the transplant course because of immediate post-operative complications, so we call this conditional survival, then that's extended out to almost 12 and a half years. And that's very different to patients with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis or COPD, which often are much older, are in their 6th or 7th decades and have got concomitant cardiovascular disease. So CF patients represent a much younger group of patients who do much better, and therefore they are the ideal patient group to target for lung transplantation. In fact, our unit, when it started, was the impetus or the motivation to start lung transplant in Cape Town came completely out of the CF clinic at Crisqueur, and the fact that this therapy is offered to other patients is a complete bystander effect. There are some very unique considerations when it comes to CF lung transplants. Firstly, they are often colonized with multi-drug resistant organisms, which makes their microbiological perioperative treatment more complex. There are certain organisms like Burkholderia cenocepacia and Mycobacterium abscessus, which represent unique challenges. Secondly, patients with cystic fibrosis have got unique comorbidities: CF-related diabetes, CF-related liver disease, distal intestinal obstruction syndrome, which are unique to this patient population and have to be managed by CF specialists and lung transplant doctors together. Thirdly, there are unique CF-specific surgical considerations. Patients who've got inflammatory lung disease like cystic fibrosis often have pleural adhesions, bronchial collaterals. We know those are the vessels that bleed when patients with CF develop hemoptysis and need embolization. And all of these result in increased surgical time, blood loss. This can affect the planning of the transplant and the amount of time that needs to be allocated to the explant. That may affect cold ischemic time if the surgeon is still taking a long time to explant the lungs. And so you've got to have a team that's experienced with the CF-specific technical considerations of a lung transplant. But then, reassuringly, is also the advantage that patients with CF are usually of a younger age. They've got no concomitant cardiovascular disease, and because of their age and their otherwise good health, are excellent rehab candidates and can often come back from even the most severe frailty to a normal effort tolerance. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of transplantation? Well, as I've said, it gives the possibility of patients having a normal quality of life. Most patients achieve normal lung function by the end of the first year after transplant, when complications such as pleural effusions and sternal wounds and the remodeling of the chest wall that occurs after this operation is resolved. There's no limitation to effort tolerance. There's no sputum production. One of the remarkable things is patients who have coughed mucus for their whole lives who wake up and say that they've got no urge to cough. There's no nebulizing, and I should have added no physio. So in terms of their lungs, they no longer have cystic fibrosis. However, this is a risky procedure and it comes with some disadvantages. Referral and listing does not come with the guarantee that we will find you a suitable donor. The surgery is risky. The post-operative ICU course is very complicated, and there is intensive follow-up with a regimen of surveillance bronchoscopies and very regular clinic visits, monitoring of immunosuppressive levels, and treatments for intercurrent infections and other complications. Like with all transplants, but particularly in a transplant that requires a high level of immunosuppression, there is a lifetime of walking the tightrope between rejection and infection. We like to tell patients this is not a cure. This is swapping one disease for another disease that's going to give you a normal effort tolerance and a much better quality of life. And of course, there's a whole host of long-term complications that result from being on long-term immunosuppression. These are some of the post-transplant care measures that can be quite onerous. I've mentioned surveillance bronchoscopies. Immunosuppression can lead to low antibody levels, and you may need supplementation with immunoglobulin. There's always the specter of both cellular and antibody-mediated rejection. You can have opportunistic infections, which might be reactivation of endogenous infections like cytomegalovirus, which you all acquire in childhood but hold in immune senescence. Or they can be newly acquired infections from the environment or from other people. You can develop steroid-induced diabetes. The drugs that we use to suppress your immune system can cause intrinsic kidney disease, and both cystic fibrosis and the CF-related and the lung transplant-related drugs can cause osteoporosis. And then lastly, your immune system is not only involved in protecting you against pathogens, but it's also involved in protecting you against cells that become cancerous or precancerous, and therefore being on immunosuppression can predispose you to developing malignancies, most likely those that are related to UV damage, such as skin cancers and the virally driven cancers like cervical cancer. Then, of course, being a transplant patient means that you've got a complex medication regimen. This is the Tupperware box that one of our patients brings with him whenever he has to come to hospital for an admission. This may seem daunting, but I think CF patients are usually quite au fait with having to deal with a whole host of complex medications. And the common response that I see from my patients is, what? You just want me to take these handful of pills? I don't have to nebulize. I don't have to wake up at 5:30 to do my physio and my flutter and my vest. So this is a group of patients who are used to having a chronic disease, and therefore they cope with the demands of the complexities of their pharmacological care relatively well. Lastly, the risks after lung transplant are not the same. Okay, they change over time, but they're always present. Early on after transplant, bacterial infections, either acquired in hospital or from the donor, or a reactivation of endogenous infection are the most common. But as you live longer and longer, cancers, chronic rejection, and even, although not applicable to CF, recurrence of the disease in the transplanted lung is something to think about. So for those of you managing CF patients in the audience, who should we refer for lung transplantation? The guidelines have recently been updated, and they suggest that you refer patients with an FEV1 less than 40%, who have more than 2 exacerbations a year requiring intravenous antibiotics, those that have an episode of massive hemoptysis requiring either admission to the ICU or bronchial artery embolization, and patients who have pneumothoraces, or anyone with an FEV1 less than 30%, or any patient with any of the following poor prognostic features, regardless of what their lung function is. If they've got a reduced effort tolerance as measured by a 6-minute walk test, if they've got respiratory failure at rest, if they've got evidence of developing pulmonary hypertension, or if they have any exacerbation that requires positive pressure ventilation, be that invasive or non-invasive. So this leads me to discuss the concept of the transplant window. So the transplant window is the time when patients who have been referred for transplant should be listed for a transplant. And this is a unique center consideration that varies from setting to setting. Clearly, we don't want to offer a complex therapy that has a chance of a poor outcome, a poor surgical outcome on somebody who's still got many years to live. At the same time, we don't want to be listing patients right at the end of their clinical course where there's only a very short time available to find a donor. The problem in our setting is that we never know, if we look at patients on the right-hand side of that curve, how long it's going to take us to find a donor. And in the next few slides, I'm going to discuss some of the unique problems we have in our country when it comes to donor shortages. So it's much better to have a wide transplant window where you are considering and working up patients for a transplant, leaving yourself many months to find them a donor, should that be what they require, rather than being referred right at the end with very advanced lung disease. So in a previous slide, I showed you the number of lung transplants done per year. If you break it down by the same graph, showing it by the number of, the geographical location of those transplant centers, you can see that by far the majority are in North America and Europe. There are a few in red labeled as other, which are generally in either Australia or New Zealand or the East. But if you look at this global graph of lung transplant centers, you can see that Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and also South America are disproportionately underrepresented. And in fact, as far as we know, South Africa is the only country in Africa offering lung transplantation. There are 2 active lung transplant centers in the country. The first one is the Mill Park Hospital, which is a Netcare hospital in Johannesburg. They've been transplanting since the early 2000s. They're the most established transplant unit in the country, and they offer lung transplants to patients on medical aids. We started our transplant center in 2017 at Groote, which, as I mentioned, has got a long pedigree in transplantation, although not in lung transplantation. And we have attracted both private and state sector patients. In fact, half of our patients are from the private sector. And I think what really works well for our 2 units is that we're geographically separated by quite a big distance, which means that there isn't competition for organs. There are also some transport considerations in getting thoracic organs to the transplant centers within their ischemic time window. And I have to say that I think that our interaction has been only positive, and that it's been a very collaborative and cooperative effort. And I have to really single out Paul Williams, who's been a great friend to our program and has really helped us a lot. So I think that this is something that could easily still grow in South Africa. But of course, our problem is donors. Now, I've put up this is a metric that's used to assess the number, how good your country is at donating. And of course, in South Africa, we've got lots of ethical and cultural objections to organ donation. But if we look at the number of donors that are consented per million people, so this is a metric that's used in the transplant fraternity to work out how many donors you have. And probably the top country in the world is Spain, which you probably all know has got an opt-in policy. So you don't say that you want to be an organ donor. You have to say that you don't want to be an organ donor. And there they've got about 50 donors per million people. Now, South Africa, and this is the 2017 data, was 1.6. And you might think that, that's understandable considering our socioeconomic and cultural mix. But if you compare that to other countries where there are actually religious objections to organ donation, such as Turkey or India, you can see that we're not doing very well. And unfortunately, that number has dropped as the COVID pandemic passed. And the latest statistics from 2021 show that our donor rate is only 0.48 per million people. So clearly, this is a major problem. Why don't we have a lot of donors? Well, I don't think we're able to look after them. Their care is often compromised due to resource limitations. We don't really admit patients who are brain dead and have got no prognosis to the ICU. They're often referred by small hospitals who deprioritize them in their emergency departments and can't really devote the ventilatory and nursing care to look after them. And in Cape Town as well, patients with traumatic brain injury are often managed conservatively a priori, because we decide that, people with really catastrophic head injuries don't have access to ICU, and that does negates a potential donor pool of patients who are never intubated or ventilated. So we've got many obstacles. Our demand is greater than the supply. We need specialized services for lung transplantation that require a lot of funding. As with all developing countries, we've got competing health priorities, so it's very difficult sometimes to advocate for the kind of expenditure of resources that goes into this very complex quaternary care when we've got so many other deficits in our healthcare system. And this donor shortage leads to very long wait lists, and I think that discourages referrals and demoralizes people in the system. So there are many challenges, but I have to say, like Marco, reflecting on the last time we were here talking about CF, I think that we've also made some strides, and hopefully we can make this more of an accessible therapy for everyone. So these are my take-home messages, and hopefully I haven't gone over time. There's no question that lung transplant is a complex and imperfect therapy, but it's also feasible for patients with all different kinds of end-stage lung disease, particularly in patients with cystic fibrosis who've got advanced lung disease, and for those who don't have access to CF modulators, it's an important rescue treatment. It requires a very large multidisciplinary team, and most importantly, a committed and supported recipient. And by supported, I mean both by society and by their families. There are 2 active centres in the country, the Mill Park Hospital in Joburg, which services private patients, and Cystic, which services both unfunded and private patients. And really, if I can just use this opportunity to kind of stress that early referral of patients is mandatory, as our transplant window in South Africa is largely influenced by donor shortage. I just want to acknowledge the very large group of people who make this work at Cystic. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions in the question time at the end. Thank you.
Let's invite Michael back to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you guys again. I promise I know more about cystic fibrosis than technical issues. So we talked about this a little bit. So in this talk, I want to talk about my experience with modulators, and also there's also some research experience with modulators over the years. And also, as you guys have heard and know well how expensive these modulators are, there are some strategies that we can use to stretch the supply of modulators that we have. I talked about this slide. Modulators basically work, people with CF, as you know, have a problem with this chloride channel that's on the membrane in their lungs. And this chloride channel pumps out salt and water onto the lining of the lung. And the lung is lined with cilia, and those cilia are bathed in water usually, and the mucus floats on top of the water. So the way mucociliary clearance normally works is there's water that lines the lung, the cilia beat, they move the water and float out your mucus. If that water isn't there, then the mucus is going to stick onto the cilia, and it will be very difficult for the patient to get rid of that, of the mucus. In the way modulators work in general is they make the mutant CFTR chloride, the channel the patient has, work some. They don't make it work as well as normal, but it works some. For most people with CF, and it's true in South Africa and in the United States, the Delta F508 mutation is the most common mutation that we see. And in the US, about 85% or so of people with CF have at least one copy of the Delta F508. I don't know the statistics in South Africa, but there probably are similar, probably not quite as high, but are similar. So in the main mutation in CF, as Delta F508, you make a chloride channel, but it's in the wrong shape. So it's made in the ribosome, and it has to go to the Golgi apparatus and have some finishing touches that are put on the molecule, and then it gets up on the membrane. If it's in the wrong shape, it gets stuck inside the cell, and then it gets recycled inside the cell. And if it does make it up on the membrane, it doesn't open up quite as well as usual. And the way these modulators work is there are molecules that change the shape of it, so some of it can get into the Golgi apparatus and make it up on the membrane, and then other molecules that once it's up on the membrane help it to open up better and get out more chloride. And the advance in CF when the Trikafta molecule so there basically are 2 types of molecules that help so modulators are made up of 2 sorts of molecules, a corrector or a potentiator. A corrector is something that gets more of the channels on the membrane, and a potentiator is something that makes the channels on the membrane open up more. So the medicine Trikafta is a combination of 2 medicines that are a corrector and 1 medicine that's a potentiator, and that putting 2 of the correctors and 1 potentiator together was what really made the difference in CF and made it such an effective modulator. And the older modulators like Orkambi and Symdeko for Delta F508 just had 1 molecule that was a corrector and 1 molecule that was a potentiator. So now we have these highly effective. So Trikafta was the second of the highly effective modulator therapies. The Kalydeco was the first one, the Kalydeco, but unfortunately only a few people. So the Kalydeco is a potentiator. It's part of Trikafta too. It helps the chloride channel that's up on the membrane to open up. If there's no chloride channel in the membrane, like in Delta F508, it's not going to help. So you had to give the combination of a corrector and a potentiator for it to work. But if you have a mutation that's amenable to Kalydeco, it's very effective. And Trikafta also is very effective and gets maybe your activity of the chloride channels compared to a normal person is maybe at 40% or so of normal, but that's enough. That's enough. The molecules like Orkambi and Simtigo, maybe the percentage of activity is at 5% of normal compared to 0%, like most patients with cystic fibrosis, 0 or 1%. So, and these are the mutations that are responsive to ivacaftor or Kalydeco, and basically all those mutations and Delta F508 are the mutations that work with Trikafta, and Trikafta seems to work better for people than the Kalydeco for the mutations that the Kalydeco is responsive to. Those seem to be even more responsive to the Trikafta. So maybe those mutations that we thought was just a problem with the chloride channel on the membrane not opening well enough, maybe not enough of them are making up on the membrane as well. So the Trikafta works best for all the mutations that ivacaftor works for, and for Delta F508, which is the most important mutation. So I told you our experience with Trikafta in our population that really changed our therapy for, changed the world for our patients with cystic fibrosis. There's also a few observational trials that we have some data on that just show how effective these medicines are and how durable the response is. So when they did the initial studies on Trikafta, they did an open label extension for a 3-year time period after the study. They did this open label extension. So we're going to look at all these patients that were in this open label extension. There was almost close to 300 patients that were in this open label extension. And when we look at this, so patients initially when they went on Trikafta had about a 14% improvement in lung function overall. And on the bottom in the gray, you can see if they were in the placebo group, they didn't get any advantage at all during the time they were on the Trikafta. But if they were in the treatment group, they had a rapid increase in lung function, and they followed this over a 3-year time period, and that lung function has been maintained over a 3-year time period. So it's remarkable how well this has worked. So we've had this marked improvement in lung function and it's been sustained over a 3-year time period. The same is true when you go on Trikafta, you have a drop in your sweat of 40 to 45 points, and that has been sustained. And actually, there's even been a little bit more of a drop in sweat over time. So the drop in sweat chloride has been maintained for patients. Also, they had a marked improvement in weight, improvement in BMI of about 1 in the study. And then that also has increased over time. So we've had a sustained improvement in weight that's actually even increased over time. So the response to these medicines, it seems to be an extremely good response that is durable over a long time period, as evidenced by these studies. So they also did a registry study in the US and in Europe, and they looked at the 5 years before patients were on Trikafta, and then they're going to look at the 5 years after. So far we just have the data on the first year after patients were on Trikafta. Eventually we'll have the 5-year data. And this is looking at 15,000 patients in the registry. So in the first year after going on Trikafta, there was a 77% reduction in the frequency of exacerbation. So in the frequency of exacerbation was defined as a respiratory illness requiring antibiotics. There was a 77% reduction in the frequency of exacerbations. So just a dramatic improvement. So patients on Trikafta, only 1 out of 10 had an exacerbation in the first year after being on Trikafta. They had a marked reduction in the number of chronic infections. So if they looked at the bacteria, as you know, patients with CF will chronically grow out these bacteria in their sputum. And I wouldn't call it a colonization. These bacteria are damaging your lungs over time. I hate when people say they're a colonizer. They're not a colonizer. They are damaging your lung in general in CF. And when we looked, and in just a year, the number of patients that were chronically infected with Pseudomonas went down from 55% down to 36%. We saw a similar drop with staph and a similar drop with aspergillus, or even a bigger drop with aspergillus, which is a fungus that in the US sometimes causes problem in CF. I don't know if it's as common here of a problem, but it's definitely a problem for us in the US. And this is the slide that I think is the most amazing slide. So they looked at historical data on these patients before, and overall, before we had Trikafta, we had about a 1.65% rate of death for people with CF each year. So 1.65% of patients with CF died each year. Once Trikafta was available, that mortality went down to 0.43%, so a 74% reduction in mortality in patients with CF. And as Marco said, we're hoping to put Greg out of business. There was an 87% reduction in the frequency of necessity for a transplant. So these drugs really are very, very good drugs. And unfortunately, they are incredibly costly drugs. And as you say, the cost seems to be unwarranted. The cost to make these drugs is much less than the cost they are charging for these drugs. And in the US, it can cost some insurers $30,000 a month to get Trikafta. That's not sustainable for anybody. But so these costs, so cystic fibrosis is a very expensive disease to care for. And now the most expensive drug we have for CF are the modulators. So I wish I had an answer to the cost. I hope that Vertex saves us, or Vertex, and or Vertex, or these other companies that are reverse engineering these drugs, or find a way to get these drugs to everybody, because everybody needs these drugs. Every patient with CF deserves access to these drugs. I do think it's in Vertex's best interest and in everyone's best interest to somehow find a solution, because otherwise they're going to be out of the equation, because somebody, this has happened before, that important drugs have been reverse engineered and then made by a generic, by a company that's a generic company for patients in need. It's happened in India. It's happening now in Argentina for the patients with CF, and it will happen again. I think we probably need some sort of model like the HIV model, where there was a license given to some generic companies to make the drug. So the company made some money off that license, and then the generic company sold the drug. So I hope that something like that will happen, but we'll see. Until it does happen, there are some ways that we can make the modulator that we have last a lot longer. We can extend the supply. All these modulators are broken down by by enzymes in the liver called CYP, by the cytochrome system, or the CYP3A enzyme of the cytochrome system. And there are drugs everyday drugs that we use that are sometimes useful in CF that really inhibit that system. So there are strong inhibitors, some of the azoles, itraconazole and posaconazole and voriconazole and ketoconazole, then some of the macrolide antibiotics, clarithromycin and telithromycin, are strong CYP3A inhibitors. Drugs like fluconazole and erythromycin are moderate CYP3A inhibitors. So I think the drug that's most useful here probably is clarithromycin. Clarithromycin is a macrolide, and macrolide antibiotics I've actually had a lot of interest in for a long time, and they actually have anti-inflammatory effects in cystic fibrosis. They probably reduce some of the neutrophil migration into the lungs, and they do some things that and they also inhibit the bacteria's ability to make some of the toxins that they make. So they tend to have, they are beneficial drugs in CF anyway. If we put you on a strong CYP3A inhibitor like clarithromycin, then what it does is it slows down the breakdown of the drug. So a little bit of drug will last a long time. So you don't have to give the drug as often, and it'll extend the supply, and it works just as well. You're not hurting the effectiveness of the drug. There's just as much of the drug around. You're just slowing the metabolism of it. So with ivacaftor, if you put somebody on a CYP3A strong inhibitor like clarithromycin, instead of taking one tablet twice a day, they just have to take one tablet just a couple times a week, twice a week. So it's actually it is it would be a seventh of what you normally would take. So 1/7 of the dose, you'll be able to get the same effectiveness. If they're on a moderate CYP3A inhibitor like fluconazole or erythromycin, they have to just take one pill a day instead of 2. So it's half the amount of drug that the patient would need. It's very similar in Trikafta, a little more complicated. Trikafta in the US comes as, I think it's similar in the way that the Argentinians have it and the way that they have it in Europe. There are 2 yellow pills that you take in the morning. They're all 3 drugs are in the 2 yellow pills. And then so the 2 drugs last all day anyway. And then in the evening, you have to take an extra pill that is blue, and it just has the ivacaftor in it. So when you're on a strong CYP3A inhibitor, it's the same thing. You have to take the 2 yellow tablets a couple times a week. So it'll be about a 3.5 times reduction in your overall dose. You'll be able to take it just twice a week instead of 7 days a week. And the blue tablets you're going to have left over, and you actually give to another patient with CF that has a mutation that's amenable to the Kalydeco, some of those mutations that I showed. So potentially you could treat 2 people with this one set of drugs by using this CYP3A inhibitor. If you use a moderate CYP3A inhibitor, you take 2 yellow pills one day and a blue pill on the alternate day. So it'll turn out to be half as much like the moderate CYP3A inhibitors with ivacaftor or Kalydeco. So I think this strategy can markedly reduce the cost of these medicines. It's still, the medicines start out at $30,000 a month, it's not going to help much. But if they start out at $2,000 a month or $3,000 a month, then that can make a difference. So if you make a $2,000 a month medicine last for 7 months or 3.5 months, that markedly reduced the cost. And clarithromycin is a well-tolerated drug that's very safe. And like I say, it may have other benefits in CF. So in conclusion, we still, these modulators are wonderful therapies for CF, but we still have to work to have even better therapies for CF. Maybe we'll have a cure for CF one day. We'll truly have a cure where we can repair your gene and you won't have CF anymore. That's maybe a dream in the future, but it's possible. But those possibilities don't matter if we can't get these medicines to the patients that need them. All patients need access to the medicines that they need for cystic fibrosis. We also have to identify all people that need medicines. I'm sure that there's a lot of people in South Africa that have CF that we don't know about. And the best way to find that out is to find a way to do newborn screening for CF. I know it's expensive and difficult, but you've overcome other obstacles to get, to have transplant care available for patients with CF in South Africa is amazing. And to have such a level of transplant care available, we can find a way to have newborn screening for CF. Even without modulators, when you diagnose infants early, they get better. Their nutrition is better. They get their care is better. Their long-term outcomes are better. And also in people of color, we underdiagnose cystic fibrosis. In the US and everywhere, we underdiagnose CF. I'm sure there's still hundreds of patients in South Africa that, in people of color that we've not identified cystic fibrosis in. So I think it's really important, to make sure that everybody, that cystic fibrosis is a disease of Caucasian people, but it's a disease of everybody. All ethnic backgrounds can have CF. It's more common in people of Caucasian descent, but it can occur in all ethnic backgrounds. Having a registry is an extremely powerful tool. It's fantastic that you guys have a registry now. And it will help to track outcomes and help you to improve the care for patients with CF. Having a lung transplant available when all these other therapies fail is extremely important. It's a great option for cystic fibrosis. In a minute, I know that Donna will be up and talk about his experience with lung transplant. Lung transplant can be life can be transforming for patients with CF. And as we have more and more patients with CF, they're going to get older and older because we're going to get better and better care, and we're going to have to deal with the problems as patients with CF get a little bit older. That's a nice problem to have, to be able to deal with the complications of old age and CF. So that's all I have to say. I really appreciate your time. I'm sorry about the technical problems, but I really appreciate your time and the ability to get to talk to such a great group of people. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Michael, and we really appreciate your knowledge and experience, sharing your knowledge and experience with us in this new exciting field. And then last but not least, I would like to invite Donald, who has orchestrated this whole evening. I first met Donald some years ago. It was a random email that he approached me just to introduce himself, and he really wanted to make a difference for people for CF in South Africa. I knew Donald's name just from a piece of paper, as I was already then looking at the records from the CF clinic at Red Cross, and he was just a name at that time. But I've got to know Donald, and we look forward. Donald has approached us, and we look forward to you hearing your journey and hearing your personal experiences. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight's event over Zoom and in person. My name is Donald Philp. I'm pleased to speak to you a little bit about my life. I hope towards the end I could find some kind of feeling of hope, inspiration, and at least some positive outlook on the lives of so many people with suffering from cystic fibrosis all over the globe. It's a very debilitating disease with so many amazing people in our community. So I was born in Cape Town, South Africa, almost about 40 years ago. In the early 1980s, cystic fibrosis wasn't really screened for at birth, and still in many countries, sadly, it's still not today. But because of this fact, I was only officially diagnosed at age 4. I presented the defect, the double delta 508 gene mutation, which is probably the most common mutation in CF today. As a child, my upbringing was very typical in every way, but my development took a little bit longer than expected. However, after my diagnosis at age 4, my growth quickly improved and I began to thrive. In Cape Town, the only medical facility at that time to actually treat people with cystic fibrosis was the Red Cross Hospital, where Dr. Zampoli has obviously dedicated so much of his time and experience for so many years. Although the resources were limited, the medical team and staff were exceptional in their care and their commitment to their patients. So at the age of 12, I faced an unexpected challenge as I developed liver disease and portal hypertension, typically associated with heavy drinking. This is not something that's common in the CF community. Only with about 8% of CF patients experience it. Concurrently, I was also experiencing frequent lung infections during my year 12 infections that didn't respond very well to oral medications, which prompted the doctors to prescribe intravenous antibiotics for the first time. So that was my first experience with that. But I kept on going. I finished primary school and elementary school. I grew up skateboarding and playing video games. I was pretty much a geek in high school. I didn't play any football or soccer, but I played the drums and in a band. And that would keep me playing I used to play into my 20s. I had a good loyal group of friends who I was able to keep up with. Even still to this day, I contact many of my friends in high school and new friends, and some of them I'm fortunate enough sitting in the audience tonight. In 1999, when I turned 16, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, also known as cystic fibrosis related diabetes. Although it's more common than liver disease, affecting less than half of the CF populations, is becoming increasingly prevalent as life expectancy is increasing. Recent statistics show that more than 35% of CF patients will develop diabetes at some point, and that number will tend to grow. In 2003, after high school, I took a gap year in the UK, and on my return, I unfortunately developed cultured Pseudomonas. And for those of you that don't know what Pseudomonas is, it's not the worst bacteria that you can culture, but it cannot be eradicated from your lungs. Once it's cultured, it stays. Right after I was cultured MRSA, which is a radio-resistant staph, which is also not the best to have. Regardless, I decided to start my studies in graphic design, which I completed and went on to do industrial design. I was fortunate enough, given my compromised health, to complete my associate bachelor's. But I, unfortunately, after a big setback in my health, I decided to rather seek full-time employment. So my health deteriorated about when I was in age 24. I was evaluated for my first transplant in Johannesburg, in Mill Park in South Africa. My lung functions fell between 45 and fell from 45 to 32%. I was very scared during this time, and I was very adamant to have an evaluation. However, I was considered too healthy at the time to be transplanted. So from an early age, I had a big desire to be independent from my family as much as possible. I just had this desire, and I used to make a lot of sandboards and sell them on a free newspaper ads. I used to import caps and sell them at university. But my first official job was for a boutique investment company. I'm fortunate enough that my boss is my first employer is actually here tonight, so in the audience. During my time in Rootstock Investment Management, I had an incredible learning experience. Initially, I was hired as a computer consultant, and I worked my way up to becoming a founding partner and a shareholder, and an opportunity for which I'm deeply grateful for even today. Despite the frequently sickness and the inability to come into work, my colleagues were incredibly understanding and supportive during this time. At the age of 30, I underwent a procedure to have a portocatheter put into my chest to allow intravenous antibiotics directly delivered into my heart and my lungs. This was basically a game changer for me, as I could even work even harder and continue the treatment while I was on the road. I remember sitting in the office with a drip, feeling unwell, but deeply committed and motivated to my job. A few years on, at the beginning of 2015, I started following the development of Vertex's second drug called Orkambi, which you guys have heard of. Their first drug a few years prior was very successful, but it only helped about 4% of the population. Orkambi would be the first drug that would be beneficial to my gene mutation. And for those of you that don't know, by this time, the modulators actually help with the underlying cause of the disease instead of the actual symptoms that have previously been treated for. So when Orkambi was approved by the FDA on the morning of the 24th of August 2015, I remember reading the article pinging on my phone. This was at nighttime. I was busy walking to a restaurant with a friend, and with tears in my eyes, I couldn't believe what I was reading at that time. Knowing that full well that it would be impossible for me to obtain Orkambi in South Africa, I reached out to all my contacts far and wide. And through a friend of mine who had a close contact relationship with a Dr. Wim de Villiers, who is currently the rector of Stellenbosch University, he happened to just fly back from Lexington, where he lived for many, many years and practiced as a doctor. And he put me in contact with Dr. Anstead, who you obviously heard speaking today, who has since become an amazing close friend. Our friendship has grown to a point where we were able to do the Cape Town cycling tour together, which was one of the most amazing experiences yesterday. The race had about 28,000 participants, making one of the largest timed cycle races in the world. Although we didn't break any records, but we completed the race in 6 hours, and it was a great accomplishment. My parents have played a big role in my life. I say that, I don't say that lightly, with them taking care and being my provider. I could not ask for a better support system than I have with them. When I wanted to achieve big things, they were always there and on my side to support my dreams. And so when it came down to visiting Dr. Anstead in the US and collecting the Orkambi, they selflessly agreed that this was a good idea. We got on the flight and landed in a small, humble town of Lexington, Kentucky. Unbeknownst to me, it was not as small. It was not as small. Dr. Anstead sees about 300 patients, pediatrics and adults altogether. And in South Africa, which is a mind-blowing number to me, because in South Africa, we barely have about 700 patients that have been diagnosed. And this was all in one clinic. We struck up an amazing friendship, and he was willing to help wherever he could. He has an amazing heart and helps people around the world, not just here in South Africa, but also in India and Ecuador. This is obviously Dr. Ansted's third trip, and hopefully with many, many more to come. So I returned the first time with Orkambi, and the next few years I was willing to fly to the US. I was very fortunate that I could fly to the US and back to collect the medication to help slow my decline of my lung functions and the constant need for antibiotics. Orkambi is a drug that didn't work as well for many people. I think statistically, if I think back now, there was about 20 to 30% of patients that actually started Orkambi actually got removed from it, as it caused a lot of lung spasms. My capacity, I was fortunate that I could tolerate it, and my lung capacity increased slightly, about 5 to 6%, which wasn't much, but it helped with some other digestive areas that are lots of problems with CF patients. In 2016, I unfortunately started vomiting blood and needed to have my esophagus veins closed and banded. And this was obviously a specific cause of cystic fibrosis. And at that stage, I call it my CF career. My lung functions sat at around 35% capacity. I was on intravenous about 3 to 6 times a year, almost every second month. So I was continuously not feeling well. I started sleeping with oxygen at nighttime because I wanted more energy during the day. But I was still going to work at this stage, but my productivity waned quite a bit. However, in 2018, my lung capacity fell very sharply, as many of the antibiotics no longer were effective. I had to call Dr. Ansted from South Africa to help me help with the dosing of the antibiotics. He's renowned for this aggressive use of antibiotics, which seemed to work wonders in a situation like myself. However, I struggled to improve, and my family and then girlfriend, and now my amazing wife, Rebecca, decided that I should be flown to Lexington and maybe be under the care of Dr. Ansted. My lung functions at that stage was below 23%, and I needed to be flown with oxygen to Europe, and then from Europe to the US. After spending a month in the hospital in the US with many different antibiotics and drugs, I was able to get my lung functions back up to 29%. But it was also during this time that Dr. Ansted sat me down and said, unfortunately, the modulators are not improving my lung capacity, and that we should possibly consider lung transplant evaluation. My life was spared this time, being saved in the US, but I needed additional intervention if I wanted to live longer. Despite being diagnosed with depression and anxiety, I can confidently say that I'm an individual who fiercely is committed to life with an abundance of grit and tenacity. As a teenager, I made the decision very early on in my life that if the chance would come for me to have a lung transplant, I would, and I believed that would make the decision, making the decision early on, I would be in the right mindset and less fearful or anxious when it came down to committing to the procedure. Once again, I was prepared for the conversation and eager to jump on the idea. However, due to my failing liver, it wasn't as simple as evaluating just my lungs for transplant. With a diseased liver, Dr. Ansted recommended I undergo a comprehensive evaluation of transplant center that could address both my liver and my lung condition. It was difficult to realize that obviously South Africa doesn't do too many combined organ transplants, and that would not be an option for me. And so the only option was to look abroad. Some countries, such as the UK and Canada, do prefer these do these transplants, but they typically prioritize citizens over for organ allocation. The US, on the other hand, allows a certain percentage of foreigners to be transplanted, making it my only consideration, unfortunately, for the procedure. Together, we decided on 4 centers, eventually setting on the Hospital of University of Pennsylvania, which is in Philadelphia in the US, and it's about an hour and a half's drive from New York, if that gives you an idea of where that's located. So right after my month-long stay in the US, after Dr. Ansted got me up and going at 29%, I flew to Philadelphia, where they did a workup on both my lungs and liver, and the team undoubtedly believed that I would not survive just with a lung transplant alone. I would need a combined lung and liver transplant done at the same time, and the other thing is I would need to be listed within 6 months. Although this was a difficult decision, we ultimately decided to seek the advice from Penn and go with their decision. So on February 26, 2019, just 6 hours before our final flight to the US, I married the love of my life in Cape Town in an apartment with 2 witnesses present and my parents, while Rebecca's parents joined over Zoom. It was a whirlwind of a day. My wife and I only had been married, just had got married. We were packing up our apartment and we were moving countries. I can't remember if I did any packing. If you ask my wife, I probably didn't do any packing. While in the US, I was mostly homebound, relying on constant oxygen support and frequent hospitalizations due to the taxing antibiotic regimes. It was a grueling experience, but my wife and I found solace in fostering and placing dogs at the local PSPCA, ultimately fostering about 12 dogs while we were in the US and finding home for about 10 of them. And one of our foster dogs we decided to keep, and her name is Winter, and she is my hairy child, and I'm a proud parent. So, however, in March 2020, the COVID pandemic hit, further limiting our mobility and social interaction. Despite the challenges, we were grateful to have arrived in the US when we did, and trusted that Penn, an exceptional hospital with absolutely amazing team, would continue to provide the best care possible, even though with the pandemic-induced shutdowns. Just before COVID spread rapidly, I was contacted by a fantastic foundation called Take a Breather. They offered me a wish, like Make a Wish Foundation, and to make my time while waiting for transplant a little bit easier. I decided to see if I can visit one of my heroes. I was blown away when myself and Rebecca was invited by Scott Galloway to visit and have supper with him and his wife on the island of Nantucket. We flew there during the afternoon, and we had supper with him, and then we flew back the same evening. It was an incredible, memorable experience, and I can only thank Take a Breather for this. Straight after, my wife potentially saved me from a diabetic coma. I'd been washing dishes late at night when suddenly I passed out and became unconscious. To this day, we still don't know how long I was out for. Rebecca already had gone to bed, but for some miraculous reason, she woke up finding me lying on the floor in the kitchen. Without a hesitation, she administered glucagon and called the ambulance. Although I'd collapsed more than 4 times at the hospital at Penn during my stays and visits, and a few times at home, this incident was by far the most frightening. I am forever grateful to my wife for saving my life, not just on this occasion, but as you will tell me, on countless others. As time passed, the waiting became increasingly difficult and my health continued to deteriorate. I was eventually put on Trikafta, but by that time my lungs had been too poor to really make a massive improvement. We even discussed the possibility of moving to another transplant center near Texas, where with the potential of better lung placements at that time. However, just 2 weeks after making this decision, I received the call for transplant. It was exactly 2 years and 2 days after we arrived in the US. Despite needing to be in 4 hours from the center to confirm the transplant, my apartment was literally 20 minutes away, and we got there in record time. While transplant day is portrayed very chaotic in movies and everything happens like so fast, my experience was quite the opposite. I was called in the center at 10 a.m. in the morning, and I was eventually transplanted that evening and moved into the operating room like in the early hours of the 1st of March. So as I lay there on the operating table, still awake and surrounded by the team of medical professionals preparing for the surgery, they asked me if I wanted to listen to any music before they put me to sleep. I remember listening to Soundgarden, Black Hole Sun earlier that week and thought this would be an appropriate choice, and which they played. Obviously, when they put me down, I would become the 141st person to ever receive this combined transplant in the US at that time. The following days after transplant was a surreal experience, almost like I was being a contestant on a game show with my wife and film crew all in on the act. I was completely hallucinating in the ICU, and took me 3 days to start feeling normal. Also, breathing for the first time is not as how it's portrayed. It took a long time for me to finally feel on top of the world, where I could actually take a massive breath. And that was after I've gone to home and gone through physical therapy through that process. During this time, I experienced strange sensations of clocks moving. This is now in the hospital, on the walls, and felt like I've moved to different rooms, which obviously never happened. So after a few days, I was moved out of the ICU and into a high intensive care. I was up and walking 4 days after transplant, but with tremendous amount of pain in the chest tube sites, which they do for draining. But it was totally worth it in the end. And if I had to end up doing it again, I would definitely consider it again. I left the hospital on my wife's 41st birthday. I had Amazon deliver some balloons and ordered some donuts for the staff. I returned home and started physiotherapy, but unfortunately, after 3 weeks, I needed to go back in hospital for another month because I had too much fluid on my lungs. While liver and lung transplants are incredibly successful combination transplants, the liver gives off an incredible amount of fluid, and that is usually used and absorbed, sucked into the open cavities that need to be settled by the lungs, and so they need to constantly be drained. A small price to pay in my eyes, really. So after graduating from physical therapy, I decided to buy a stationary bike for exercise, and I became completely obsessed with it. I would cycle almost 6 times a week, which is crazy. I was still incredibly weak and built up stamina very slowly, but it gave me an incredible amount of confidence. I remember breaking out in tears during my first few milestones on the bike, as I couldn't believe what I was doing and accomplishing. Our medical visa unfortunately only allowed us to stay a year post-transplant, and so I decided to do as much traveling as possible during that time to see if I can relive my 20s and 30s, which I never really lived to my fullest. I flew to a few tech conferences, I snowboarded my heart out, and I visited about 13 states while I was in my recovery time. I was incredibly unfortunate to have met my donor family, the Pastorellis. It was an incredibly emotional experience to meet a family that's obviously had their loved one pass away and donate their organs to you. He will always be in my mind, Michael Pastorelli, and you will always be with me, and that's an amazing thing and selfless thing that him and the family has done. A year after my transplant, my wife, who hails from the UK, and I decided to move there and start a new life with our beloved dog, Winter. It's hard to put into words how much my life has changed since transplant, it's almost a rebirth. I left my old life behind, and I'm completely embracing my new one, filled with new ambitions and possibilities. One of these ambitions, which I think is absolutely crazy, I think is as difficult as going through the transplant, but a lot of people don't agree with me, is trying to pursue a medical MBA, getting into a medical MBA program in the US and completing my master's in business of healthcare. While the road is uncertain and rejection is at any stage possible, I'm determined to achieve my goals and reach for the stars. Wish me luck, as I need all of the luck I can get. There's so much I can tell you more about my process. I've left so much out, but I thought I'd end up just with a few comments for the many parents, the patients, and the friends of CF that are listening. First one, don't hide or exclude your kids from anything they want to do. It might not seem like the best option at the time, but you'll regret it in the future, not allowing them to do what they want after. Decide on transplant early in your life. It makes the decision process much easier. Anything is possible with enough tenacity. Don't take no for an answer. If you get a no over the phone back again and again and speak to someone else every time until you get a response you want. Be productive, be adventurous, be courageous, and have big ambitions, and try and become the best version of yourself if you can. If someone hasn't told you that you can't do something, assume that you can do it and just do it. Be as honest as possible, and if you need help, seek it. Don't worry about what people think, and ask for forgiveness later. and fight, always fight. Life is too amazing and precious to give up. I want to thank Dr. Shaquette, Dr. Bermudez and his team, Dr. Kaplan, Dr. Hodge and his team, Jackie Gallardo, one of my favorite nurse practitioners, Dr. Weinreeb, my amazing friends, you know who you are, my therapist, Jill Back, and most importantly, Dr. Anstead for also being here through so much. I couldn't do this without my family, Mark and Letitia Fulp, my brother, Robert Fulp, and Amy Woodendahl. You guys are the best. And obviously my love of my life, Rebecca, who's obviously some of the really good reasons why I'm here. Anyway, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much. And thank you all to everyone who've been here and for listening, both online. We do have some time for questions. So maybe we can start in the audience first. Does anyone who have questions? Greg, your hand up.
I've got a question from Michael. In view of all the complex drug interactions with CF modulators, I mean, you mentioned obviously clarithromycin and then also the azoles. How do you manage that in practice? Do you have access to therapeutic drug monitoring? I mean, if you've got a patient who's on voriconazole for aspergillus and a modulator and clarithromycin, how do you know where you are?
You could make other, like, for example, if I had to put a person on a, I do have the help of the pharmacist. We have a pharmacist, and our pharmacist, Lauren, she's incredible. And so we have a lot of pharmacy support that you guys may not have. And sometimes when I have questions that you think I'm answering, I'm asking my pharmacist, but I involve our pharmacist a lot. But, there's other options. For example, if I had a patient on clarithromycin and I had to put the patient on voriconazole, I might, it might be unpredictable, the effects. You could switch them off of clarithromycin and put them on azithromycin instead, which doesn't have the CYP3A inhibition. It works just as well as a macrolide. So there would be some choices there. Most of the time, being on one strong CYP3A inhibitor or two, it's kind of like, it's like infinity sort of. It doesn't make a difference. You can be on two and it doesn't have that big of an impact. I've been once or twice. I've left people on two strong CYP3A on two strong inhibitors, and it didn't make a difference. But most of the time, if I was concerned, I'd switch them over from clarithromycin over to azithromycin for the macrolide. Yes, Belinda.
Hello. I just want to find out, do you have any of these case studies readily available for like places like Vertex Savers, the CF Bias Club, and also for us here in South Africa?
I'm sorry, Belinda, what was that again, please?
Do you have any of the case studies for the twice weekly dosage?
I mean, it's something we use all the time. I mean, it's pretty accepted. That's the dosage. I mean, I have, so basically most patients, what you'll do if you put them, like, let's say I have a patient I have to put on voriconazole because they have allergic aspergillosis, then I'll switch them over to a twice a week dose of Trikafta. And most patients will feel that they feel the same and their lung function will be the same. There are some now, unfortunately, the ideal thing would be able to measure a level, to be able to measure a Trikafta level. Unfortunately, those aren't available right now. But there are patients that sometimes say, okay, I don't feel like I'm getting enough drug. I feel like it's not the same. And then we'll just empirically increase the dose to up from 2 times a week, up to 3 times a week or every other day. But usually they don't require any more than every other day, regardless of the CYP3A inhibitor. And we could compile those the patients that we've used this for, but it's really a common thing that we do all the time. Because we have a lot of patients. We actually, probably the most common reason we use it, we have the luxury of not having to use it to save the modulators, But a lot of times we have patients with allergic aspergillosis that have to be on an azole, and we have to combine an azole, and then we reduce their dose of the Trikafta while they're on the azole. And like I say, the majority of patients, they don't notice a difference when we reduce the dose. And I've had a few patients on clarithromycin that we've done it for reasons that they were not going to be with insurance, so we could stretch out their supply until they could get insurance again, and it's always worked just as well. And I think that Marco and Greg can comment. They've used this for their patients, and I think so far they've had good results with it. Is that right?
Thanks. Thanks to your advice, we've been following the strategy, and I think the results have been pretty impressive. We're actually just the one point that we're trying to do is we're trying to use the sweat test as a monitoring tool to check efficacy of the drug. So
yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
That's a great idea. Without being able to measure the level, and then the next best thing, or maybe even a better thing, would be to measure the sweat test and see if it was the same when you add it to clear. The only negative of that is you have to have a period of time that you have to give them the full dose of the drug, and then switch them over to the clarithromycin and the less frequent drug.
I have a question. It might be of interest to the people online as well. Can you maybe just clarify why, if you do use the clarithromycin, why you shouldn't use the evening for the ivacaftor pill? Why? What's the rationale behind that?
Well, it's pretty much the same dosage, so it just extends. So it would be the same dosage as the ivacaftor, because there's already some ivacaftor. It extends all three drugs about the same, and there's already some ivacaftor in the morning dose, so you're getting all three drugs, so you don't need that evening dose of the ivacaftor. You're only taking it a couple times a week. It's just not necessary. It'll still end up the same, and if you look at it, it works out to be the same dose. If you look at the ivacaftor dosing for ivacaftor, the amount of ivacaftor is the same if you're giving a strong CYP3A inhibitor to people on Kalydeco alone. It ends up being the same amount of drug that they're exposed to.
I'd like to ask whether you have experience of a different combination of the drugs. We've had a recommendation of taking one morning pill a day, and every second day an evening pill in addition to the single morning pill, and that way stretching it by a half.
Is that for people on a CYP3A inhibitor, or in people without on the CYP3A inhibitor?
No, without the inhibitor.
I mean, I would just use the inhibitor. I think you're going to get less effect if you use a lower dose of drug. Sometimes people with liver disease need less drug, but in general, I think that you won't get I think it won't be as effective. I think the best way to stretch these drugs is to use a CYP3A inhibitor, and probably for most people, clarithromycin is going to be the drug that you're going to want to use, because it has some other benefits and other reasons you might give to people in CF.
Thank you.
Hi, Kathy Bird from Johannesburg. So we have successfully used the CYP3A inhibitor, and exactly what you mentioned, taking the Trixacar or Trikafta and donating on the blue tablet, ivacaftor only, to a patient who has a mutation responsive. So we've had a patient sharing, basically, taking 2 orange tablets twice a week in combination with clarithromycin twice a day, and then donating on the blue tablets 2 ivacaftos, 1 ivacaftor twice a week on the oral clarithromycin. Both patients have done well, and we've monitored their sweat tests.
That's the perfect way to do it. I think that's the perfect way to do it. I think that is ingenious. I think that's definitely the way to do it.
My question is, what about the patients who don't want to abuse macrolide? What about the patients who are not colonized with Pseudomonas or gram negative, who don't need a macrolide?
Well, I mean,
Okay.
the macrolides were really effective. You know, when you looked at the, I mean, they did, you know, we did a study and I was a member of that study where we looked at macrolides in patients that were not infected with Pseudomonas. We picked our primary outcome. We didn't pick it well. There was actually a significant drop. There wasn't an improvement in lung function. There was a significant drop in the frequency of exacerbations. So I think that macrolides still have, they are beneficial in patients even without Pseudomonas. So I think you can, and they're very safe. I mean, clarithromycin, you know, maybe if you get on other drugs that prolong the QT interval, you might get into trouble. It does have that, you know, it does prolong the QT interval. So if you end up on, and that's another reason not to put somebody on voriconazole and clarithromycin because of the QT interval issues, and to put them on azithromycin instead, probably then, which has a much lower impact on QT interval. But I think they're very safe drugs. They have a few side effects, some GI tract side effects sometime, but actually a lot of patients with CF have gastric emptying issues too. That's a very common problem in CF, and all these macrolides improve the gastric emptying for patients. So I think they're really safe drugs. I mean, I put almost every patient with CF on macrolides. We use them in the transplant population to reduce the risk of rejection. There might be a reduced risk of chronic rejection. So, you know, I think macrolides should be in the water, but they're generally very safe and helpful drugs. So I think you can feel good about using them. I don't think you're abusing them. I don't think you're exposing them to other drugs. You know, but there might be times that you might use a different drug. For example, if they have really bad problems with their gastric emptying, erythromycin might be even better. So you might use erythromycin, you might use a moderate CYP3A inhibitor. There's some people, you know, some women that get a lot of yeast infections with CF because they're on all these antibiotics and nebulized antibiotics. Maybe you want to put them on fluconazole. Those won't have as strong of an inhibition. You won't get as much of a benefit of reducing the dose, but they still might be, you know, drugs that might make more sense for that individual person.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
I see there was a question on the Q&A about is there any difference between those who would take it daily or twice weekly? I think we don't actually have any clear evidence, but I think South Africans are going to probably produce it, and maybe I can just use the opportunity to remind anyone who is on Trixacar and is changing dose or full doses. We're actually in the process of collecting all that information. So please do speak to your doctor, because this is where we're going to get the proof, the evidence that this strategy is actually effective. It's by using your data.
And as Marco said, you could, if you had somebody on it, you could measure their sweat test, and then you could switch their dose and measure their sweat chloride again. And that's a real biomarker that will show you, you know, how effective it is. So not only how you feel, but be able to check the sweat test. And we've done that in a few patients where they felt like it wasn't as effective, but we don't always have a baseline sweat. So if you guys have the ability of a baseline sweat on everybody on the full dose, and then if you have to adjust the dose, you can check the sweat test again and see where it's at. It's a brilliant way to do it, as Marco's done it.
All right.
Good evening. As a friend of Donald and absolute layman on the subject, I do have a question regarding the Vertex company. Is there any historical records of a company like Vertex or any pharmaceutical company actually caving into the demand? I understand that the demand and the market in North America and Europe is actually quite large, but South Africa is a very small market, 700, your patients. What are the chances of a company like Vertex or another pharmaceutical company caving and actually reducing prices? Or coming to the market, in essence.
I'm going to maybe ask Belinda to answer that.
Yeah. Better than me.
No, I'll just suggest okay. It has been done in the past, especially with Gilead, with regards to hepatitis C. So they did issue compulsory licensing to numerous pharmaceuticals. And what happens is those generic manufacturers pay the original pharmaceutical company royalties in order to produce those drugs. So it's not as if they lose out on any money, et cetera, et cetera. So it has been done in the past by numerous pharmaceuticals.
Is it per country or is it globally? Do they just say, listen, we're going to open it to the global market or to certain countries?
It's normally done globally, yes.
Thank you.
All right. And I think that brings us to the end of this evening. I just want to thank all the speakers, to Michael, especially who's come all the way from Kentucky. I'm glad that you and Donald had a successful cycle tour. Otherwise, this evening may not have happened. Well done. Congratulations. It was a bit of a risky chance. And I think everyone online who's listening, and we've had close to 100 people, and everyone here came in person. And I just want to finish off saying that I think it's a very exciting time in the CF community, internationally, but also in South Africa. I think we should be proud of ourselves. We may sometimes feel doom and gloom that we're being left behind, but I think what's happened in the last few years has been remarkable. And it's really been, I'm very proud to be part of it. So thank you very much, and thank you, everyone.